Welcome back to the second session talking about the development of radio in India and the world. Hope you are finding this mesmerizing story of the journey of this medium called radio really interesting. So, in this session we are going to take care of the following topics. One, we are going to look at the way radio has evolved after independence. Then we will also look at the post-colonial period. We are also going to look at the recommendations of Vardham Committee and the time of free airwaves. Then we are going to look at the formation of Prasar Bharati through an act of parliament and the way the radio and its development, the journey that has been till date. So, let us look first at radio after independence. In the previous session, I was discussing how while evading any kind of arrest by the British forces and the British police, the freedom fighters of India were making use of radio in the best possible manner to transfer their messages and communicate with the masses in general and to make sure that they all come together politically. So, now when the British left India, it was a divided India. Thus, India was left with only 6 stations, and these stations were in Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Chennai, Lucknow and Tiruchirappalli. And there were 18 transmitters, 6 on the MW, which was the medium wave, and the rest were on short wave. The coverage area was 2.5% and 11% of the total population only. The radio listening on medium wave was confined only to the urban areas, and it was no longer being used or looked upon as a segment that could bring about development, and there were no clear development goals for some time right after we gained independence. The role of communication for national development was underscored in India because till such time as 1947, our primary objective was to gain freedom from the clutches of the British. And once we had that, it took us some time to reconcile ourselves to the fact that we are going to have a different nation in the form of Pakistan, and then how we would bring about national development, how media can be used, particularly radio because television had not come so far, and how it should be given priority over all other issues. So, this issue of national development was underscored in India even prior to her independence. Now, the Indian National Congress, while formulating policies for national development for independent India, they had set up a subcommittee on communication under the National Planning Committee. And this subcommittee would report to the National Planning Committee, and they would offer recommendations for development of communication for independent India and the way communication, media, policy making can be put to good use while formulating development policies. The report of the National Planning Committee cited the following as the target of broadcasting for independent India. So, they talked about dissemination of news and useful information. They talked about adult education because the rate of illiteracy in the country was very high, and fighting rural ignorance. There was too much of superstition, too much of ignorance which had to be fought with, and so as to bring the ruralites at par with the urbanites. And then there was propaganda by the state and of course entertainment. After independence in 1947, the new Indian government announced a development oriented agenda of governance which was dedicated to an amelioration of economic, educational and health conditions of the people. So, primarily we began to look at radio as something which would bring about development in economic sector, in educational sector as well as the health sector. Targeting development communication, the new government adopted the recommendations of the National Planning Committee, and it became the mainstay of its communication policies. Despite the fact that we do not have very clear media policies in the country even now, yet we began long back as the time when we gained independence. And P.C. Joshi in his book Communication and National Development wrote that the issue of using modern communication acquired high priority as a developmental resource during the Nehru era, when the planners explored the prospects of using radio as a development agent. That is for information and for enlightening of people in the countryside and towns on developmental issues. So primarily during the Nehruvian era, we saw the formulation of 5-year plans. 5-year plans have been discontinued just some time back. But these 5-year plans also had their major agenda and their major focus on development. Why? Because India was largely an agrarian economy, and also because the large part of the country was a rural belt. So we had to bring them into the mainstream. So ideally the challenge was to identify the development issues in various communities and societies of the country, and then to use media, at that time radio, towards achieving the developmental goals. Post-independence growth plan was chartered by drafting the Bombay Plan, also called A Plan, for the economic development of the country. India was left in ruins by the time British left. So the primary focus was not just social development but also economic development. It was a challenge to generate employment, it was a challenge to kill illiteracy in the country, and it was a challenge to bring about the rural belts of the country together into the mainstream. Also at the same time we were fighting the geographical adversities that the country has. And towards this A plan, this was being drafted by the Tata, J.R.D. Tata and G.D. Birla, and it was being extensively discussed in this journal which Birla owned, and it was called the Eastern Economist. This plan had supported private enterprise and protectionist policies in support of indigenous capital. However, the state remained the nodal agency in the area of economic growth. In 1955, the industrial policy statement was adopted. In this policy, basic and strategic industries, including heavy industrial plants, etc., were all reserved for development in public sector. Similarly, in the Industrial Policy Resolution of 1956, telecommunication, broadcasting and defense equipment was also reserved for the public sector only. Now 1955 was the time when people started realizing that using the modernization concepts and models of the West will not be the best solution in the Indian scenario, because we were coming across the stages of development, like W. Rostov in 1955 had come up with the 5 stages of development, where he said that a society develops from being a traditional society to preconditions of takeoff, where they are prepared to take a step forward towards development, to the actual position of development where the society is taking a stride towards development, and then how do they behave, the level of acceptance post development, the mental state of mind of a community, of society, of individuals towards development. So this was the time when people had started noticing and realizing and acknowledging formally that the Western models of development were not for us. So now let us look at what radio did during the post-colonial period. In the first 5-year plan, no financial allotment was done for the broadcasting sector, but investment to the tune of 4.94 crores was done in 1956 during that time. Most of the region was covered by AIR. Second 5-year plan envisaged the wider coverage, and for the first time the plan document spoke about setting up a TV station with an allocation of rupees 40 lakhs. So TV formally came to India during the time of emergency 1975-76, but it was being promulgated. The very idea of conceiving how TV could take up the cause of development in the country was being envisaged during the second 5-year plan. Of the entire plan allocation of 9 crores in the maximum amount, that is 267.8 lakhs, was earmarked for studio installation and additional office accommodation. Hence the focus was on infrastructure development, and this trend continued over many years. However, the growth had not been so fast. By 1960, 56% of the population and 37% of the country's area was covered by medium wave services. Therefore, the majority of the area was left to short wave coverage only. During that time, the system of collecting license fee was in force, and this license fee actually got abolished only in 1970s. So, what is this license fee? A person with a radio set was required to deposit a fee amount at the local post office to ensure continuing reception of signals in his radio set. This is quite like we recharge our television sets today. The digital set, TV set-top box needs recharging on certain period of time. So, similarly, radio required some licensing fees, and it is still in vogue in the UK. So, in the United Kingdom, we still have this provision of paying a license fee as far as BBC is concerned. BBC has been able to retain its autonomy largely because of this license fees that it keeps collecting regularly. Thus, they do not depend on the government fund for sustenance. And this system of collecting license fees was, like I just said, it was eventually abolished in the year somewhere during the 1970s. After 1968, the annual rate of increase in licenses has fallen steadily, and the number of households with radio sets were only about 25 million. Even production of sets witnessed a slow decline. So, radio sets were more in demand than could be supplied during the period of 1960 to 70. But post 1970, the demand started declining. But this was the first time when Green Revolution in India was coming to India, and it was in full swing, and AIR had been chosen to be a close companion of the revolution. So, for any revolution to spread in a society or become a part of the community, it is important that it be supported by media, it be properly supported by strategic campaigns, so that the message does not get exterminated on the way and it reaches the audience and creates that effective change. So, AIR was chosen to be a close companion when India was looking at the Green Revolution. It was naturally expected that the demand will increase for the sets, but that did not happen. In spite of the slowdown in the listeners' base, the setting up of stations and transmitters went on, and most of the transmitters were set up as a part of political necessities. Why? Because even post the British period, India started to feel, the politicians in India who arose started to feel that they needed to connect with the audiences, and radio possibly was the best medium of connecting with the audiences and influencing them in order to get more votes. So, in 1962, India fought a war with China in the northeastern front. This war revealed the inadequacy of reception of radio signals in the border areas. So long we had no idea, no clue of how good the transmission was, and that is why perennially the geographical boundaries of India, the geographical terrain of India is always a matter of concern when it comes to radio frequencies. But till the Sino-Indian War happened, we did not realize that we were not able to reach out to the borders, and that is why probably the Indian military also suffered. As a follow-up, the government constituted a committee on broadcasting and information media, which was popularly known as the Chanda Committee, and this was on 14th of December 1964. The committee reviewed the operation of various media units under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. So, while it reviewed the operation of various units, it submitted a kind of report on radio and TV on 18th of April 1966. The committee felt that it was not possible in the Indian context for a creative medium like broadcasting to flourish under the regimentation of departmental rules and regulations where it continued to stay. Therefore, it recommended the constitution of a separate corporation for radio and TV, all electronic media. The report also suggested that both of them be given freedom to evolve their own recruitment rules, pay and service condition according to their varied and peculiar necessities. Another recommendation was for starting of a commercial service, and it was started from Vividh Bharati in the year 1967. In April 1970, the Lok Sabha was informed by the government that it was not the opportune time to consider the conversion of AIR into an autonomous corporation. But a major structural change was accepted, and this structural change involved separation of radio from television. Doordarshan came into existence on April 1, 1976 under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Soon after the internal emergency, a white paper on the misuse of mass media during the emergency was presented to the Parliament in August 1977. So, during the elections, the opposition parties presented freedom of expression, including autonomy to electronic media, as a major election plank. After the new Janata Party government took charge, the working group on autonomy for AIR and Doordarshan was constituted by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting by a Gazette notification which was dated August 17, 1977, under the chairmanship of the great B.G. Varghese alongside 11 members. Now, let us look at what were the major recommendations of the B.G. Varghese Committee. Setting up of an independent public corporation acting impartially as trustee in the public interest, referred to as Akash Bharati in the tune of National Broadcasting Trust. So, NBC corroborated more with Akash Bharati, and that is why it was named so. The committee did not want two separate corporations for Akashvani and Doordarshan, but they suggested a highly decentralized 4-tier broadcasting organization at central level, at zonal level, regional level, as well as local level. India hosted the Asian Games in 1982, and TV, which was till then at a nascent stage, received a major boost. In 1984, Rajiv Gandhi became the Prime Minister of India, and he was very keen on science and technology as well as the medium of television. The entire political focus shifted to the new medium. The popularity of AIR also declined. There was a general apathy in the government to rejuvenate the medium of radio. And then came the time of free airwaves. 1990s was very critical period of India, both politically and economically. It is important to understand the development of a medium vis-a-vis its political and economic developments, its social raisings. So, ideally it is important to understand the political picture of the country as well as global picture and the economic countdown that had begun by that time. India was suffering from internal political instability, and the fragile National Front coalition faced a nationwide crisis in the summer of 1990 over its affirmative action policies. By autumn, a campaign by the BJP to build a Hindu temple at the site of a 16th century mosque in Ayodhya resulted in widespread communal violence. The government collapsed when the BJP pulled out. A new minority government failed to pass the scheduled budget in February 1991 when it lost the Congress party's external support. In May 91, while campaigning for the general elections, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. In reaction and in parallel to these developments, the economic situation of the country worsened. By September 1990, net inflows of non-resident Indian deposits had turned negative. Access to commercial borrowing had become more costly, and by December, even short-term credit was restricted. The foreign exchange reserves fell to $1.2 billion in January 1991, and by the time a new government took over in June, reserves could cover only 2 weeks of imports. India was close to defaulting on its sovereign debt for the first time in its history. Thus, India negotiated a $1.8 billion loan from IMF with conditions. The condition applied by IMF resulted in the structural adjustment program, which preempted the involvement of the state in state expenditures in many welfare sectors including health, and education. Neoliberalism had entered India with full force. Now let us look at the formation of Prasar Bharati. Prasar Bharati Broadcasting Corporation of India, which was the BCI Act, was enacted with the objective of conferring autonomy on Akashvani and Doordarshan, thereby ensuring that they function in a fair, objective and creative manner. The Prasar Bharati Act provided a direction and a pointer which should govern the broadcasting policies. The demand for autonomy for AIR and TV dates back to mid-60s, when the first ever expert committee, the Chanda Committee, went into this issue. The Prasar Bharati Bill of 1989 is largely based on the Virgis report of 1978 and the Prasar Bharati Bill of 1979 that was introduced by the Janta regime in Parliament in May 1979. The Prasar Bharati Bill favored the creation of a broadcasting corporation through an act of Parliament. But the Virgis report clearly wanted broadcasting autonomy to be a part of Indian Constitution. This would make it necessary to ensure that no future government would tamper with the freedom and independence of the corporation. The bill managed to sneak in a representative of MIB as a part-time governor. This was not the full autonomy that the PG Virgis Committee had in mind. The bill of 1979 became an act in 1990 with the approval of all political parties in the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. The first step the ruling Congress government took in response to the invasion by cross-border satellite television was to set up the Vardham Committee, which was in the year 1991, to re-examine the Prasar Bharati Act of 1990. The Ram Vilas Paswan Committee was set up for this purpose in 1995, and it submitted a 104-page working paper with 46 recommendations on public and private electronic media, newspapers, news agencies as well as films. The committee had hammered out consensus on national media policy. Some of the recommendations were incorporated in the broadcasting bill introduced in Parliament in May 1997. The Nitish Gupta Committee, which was formulated in the year 1996, was constituted to have another look at the Prasar Bharati Act and to suggest amendments if any. It submitted its report in August of the same year. Governments had never been serious about giving autonomy to official electronic media. So the bill remains a dead letter. Even to this date, we all know that AIR and DD are the mouthpieces of the government. Whoever is the government uses it to trumpet its own messages, its own cause, its own advertisements, publicity and various other kinds of information through which it can impact the vote bank in the country. This was also the time when the Supreme Court of India gave a ruling declaring airwaves as public property, which came in the year 1995. This translated into the radio sector being opened up to private players. Now a handful of big business houses with non-media and media interests have dominated the FM radio market. The idea of people with media interest is that when they proliferate further into different kinds of media, it requires less input, less capital seed money to establish it, and they are able to get more output, more returns out of this media venture. At the same time, those businesses who have no media interests would like to venture into some kind of media interests, because media in itself is a potent tool of influencing the masses. So, through their media interests and through their media businesses, they are able to get profits into their non-media businesses. For a long time, it was debated that this is not considered to be an ethical step to take, but nevertheless, privatization of radios has happened, and a lot of big media houses have had a stake in the creation of the FM radio market in India. the then Finance Minister P. Chidambaram had announced the licensing of 295 more radio stations in the year 2013 to 14. Private FM channels are mainly urban centric and play 24/7 film songs. So, even to this day, right from the time of independence 1947 till this date, the basic focus of these FM channels is on the urban belt of the country. News is not allowed to be broadcast yet, and another offshoot of this was community radio. Several non-government organizations and media activist groups campaigned for nearly a decade for the right to set up local radio broadcasting facilities to support their community development work. They also networked to further the cause of community radio in the country. Now, this network, soon after the announcement of the community radio policy, came together in January 2007 to constitute the Community Radio Forum, CRF for short, in India. CRF has supported and promoted the setting up of community radio stations in the country and to lobby for policy changes that would amplify the progressive nature of the community radio policy and further simplify and democratize the licensing procedures. Since it is so difficult to procure, it was so difficult to procure licensing for community radios and for campus radio, despite the fact that these offshoots of radio were the best means of carrying out development in communities. So, in small communities, it requires less equipment and less infrastructure, so less capital money, and at the same time it is able to propagate development related messages or messages of social concerns, political awareness, so on and so forth. The Bangalore based communication campaign group, it was called Voices. It convened a gathering of radio broadcasters, policy planners, media professionals and not-for-profit associations in September 1996 to study how community radio could be relevant, should allocate regular airtime for community broadcasting was put forward. Requests were also made for granting licenses to NGOs and other non-profit making groups for running community radio stations. Subsequently, UNESCO made available a portable production and transmission which it called the briefcase radio station kit to Voices, so that it is able to do some experimental broadcast of programs for a hands-on learning experience towards the objective of setting up an independently run community radio station. So, it was only with the efforts of UNESCO that we were able to get our community radio station and experiment on it for the first time. These intense advocacy efforts about community radio broadcasting for the social sector finally catapulted into an inclusive community radio policy which was approved by the Union Cabinet in November 2006. As of 2012, there are 125 functioning community radio stations in India. Of these 125 stations, more than 90 are campus radio stations located either in the campuses of educational institutions like colleges and universities or in Krishi Vigyan Kendra with the focus of helping the farmers and solving their problems, which is also done through call centers as well as these campus and community radios. By the end of March 2018, there were 238 functioning community radio stations in India. Out of these 135 campus radio stations located in educational institutions, and they were also located in the state agricultural universities. So, today the state's role has been diminished to being an enabler. Even the state media apparatuses, Doordarshan and AIR have been following the revenue model of the private media houses. So, this is the journey that we have come to from the time of pre-independence till the state of in the year 2020. And I hope you enjoyed this journey of development of radio. Thank you for being with us. Have a great day.